So December turned out to be a really good reading month. This is why, even though I didn't finish my December TBR, this is why I wasn't worried about what was actually going to be on the TBR and the fact that it was quite large, because I knew that in the last couple of weeks of the month, I was going to end up reading a ton. So just in the last 2 weeks of December alone, I read 4 books and made progress in 2 others. But jumping straight into those stats, in December, I read 3,107 pages, which broke down to an average of 100 pages per day, which is like 100 pages per day is what I always aim for, but a lot of times throughout this year I haven't really been hitting that. The star ratings we had were 1 2-star, 3 3-stars, 3 4-stars, and 1 5-star, breaking down to an average of around 3.5 per book, which is my general average rating. For the demographics, it was very simple this month. We had 8 adult books. For the formats, I read 6 standardly formatted novels, 1 comic, and 1 novella. For the genres, we had 3 romance, 2 fantasy, 2 fantasy romance, and 1 science fiction. And lastly, for the places where I sourced these books from, 6 of them were books that I hauled in 2022. 1 of them was from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2022, and 1 of them I read on Kindle Unlimited. And we're actually going to be kicking off with the Kindle Unlimited one straight off, because this was actually the 2nd book I finished in the month, but the next 3 are kind of a package deal almost. You'll see what I mean. But the first one that I finished was Sweet Sin by Savannah Miller. This one is the novella that comes before Promises and Pomegranates, and Promises and Pomegranates is actually one of the books that I made progress on but didn't finish in December. I'm, I think, about 120 pages into that one. But this series is a mafia romance. I think every book follows a different couple, but the novella and the first book follow a mafia princess who is very attracted to the man that her father uses to kill people. I'm very new to mafia romance. I read my first mafia romances this month, so I don't know the terminology, but this guy, I think he's called Cal, and he kills people for the head of this mafia family, and he has a thing for the daughter. So Sweet Sin is actually the story of the mafia princess losing her virginity to this guy, and then Promises and Pomegranates is where they are being blackmailed. The head of the family and also the mafia princess are being blackmailed. So instead of marrying the guy that she's been supposed to marry her entire life, she ends up in a forced marriage with Cal. So Promises and Pomegranates, I'm not loving as much as I actually really like this novella. This was very short, very smutty, a little bit dark, and I had a really good time with it. It does have knife play and blood play, which personally isn't my favorite, but I've noticed when it comes to smut as opposed to just general romance, I do prefer my books to be like under 200 pages, like a one-night smutty novella kind of situation, as opposed to like a full-length novel. The reason why I read this series is actually on my Kindle Unlimited TBR that I posted recently, but another reason why I wanted to read this is because Savannah Miller is actually one of the authors who are going to be at Rare London, which is a romance like author and reader event that I'm attending in July 2023. So the reason why I actually picked up this novella at the time that I did is because I was in the middle of Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro, which was the first book that I read for my latest installment of Is the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship Worth My Money? And this is very slow paced. I was a little bit bored, so I picked up the novella to kind of like motivate me to read a little bit more, I guess. But this one is an adult fantasy. Content warnings in here and very early on for like sexual assault and miscarriage in the first couple of chapters, although I wouldn't say that either instance is especially graphic, but it very quickly established at the beginning, because I wasn't sure going into it, but it very quickly established that this is an adult novel. It's the first book in a series, and it is following these magically gifted children. It's very like X-Men or Umbrella Academy. There are 2 almost headhunters for this school for gifted children, and they go out into the world and they find orphaned children with magical abilities and take them to this place called the Kerndale Institute. Now very early on it is kind of unclear whether the Kerndale Institute can be trusted, which I did think was an interesting dynamic to this book. It's set in the 1800s in all over the world really, because there's elements of it in America, there's elements of it in London, but the Kerndale Institute itself is in Edinburgh. It was very promising to me from the start because it has, while the writing style isn't the best thing I've ever read, there were instances where it kind of felt like it was breaking the style of the time period, and also the sentences were running on a little bit long. But for the most part, especially throughout the beginning, I found that the writing and the atmosphere in this book were on point. It had this creepy, almost gothic Victorian atmosphere that I was actually really enjoying, considering I'm not a big fan of historical books in general, although sometimes I do like a historical fantasy. It did, however, kind of lose me around the 200-page mark. I felt that this got very boring very quickly. The most interesting part about this was the Institute, and I felt like we took a very long time to get there. There was nothing in this that hooked me, that made me want to continue reading it, because it's very slow plot-wise. It's very slow in every way possible, really. And while I do enjoy books like that, I feel like if you're giving me a book like that, then you have to give me characters to root for. And there were so many characters in here written in a way where like you're not necessarily supposed to become attached to them. It's not a writing style that's necessarily sympathetic to the characters. And so I felt if I wasn't rooting for the characters and the plot was so slow paced, there wasn't really anything in here to keep me hooked. So sadly, this one was a 3-star read for me. The 3-star like middle of the road rating was essentially because I did really like the atmosphere in here, and there were things about it that I did like, but I definitely won't be continuing on with this series. I then read one of my favorite books of the month, which is The Final Strife by Sarah El-Arifi. Although this did come with its own kind of issues, but this one is an adult fantasy that is set in a world where people are separated by blood. It's a high fantasy, so it's set in a made-up world, and it draws on Arabian and African mythology. But the world is split into 3 blood types. So right at the bottom of the pile, you have people with translucent blood, and they are actually being oppressed for a rebellion that happened hundreds of years ago. So when they're born, they are immediately mutilated. They have their tongues and their hands removed to kind of keep them in their place. In the middle, we have the blue bloods. These are your peasant class. Some of them can rise a little bit above their station. We can have merchants in this class, but generally you're just gonna have like your just slightly lower than average citizen within this class. And then right at the top, forming the majority of the main citizens, the merchants, the nobility, etc., are the red bloods. So the main characters of this book are 3 female characters, one from each of the blood types. And in the past of this world, 12 blue-blooded babies were swapped with red bloods so that the ones with red blood could be raised among the blue bloods and taught how oppressed the lower classes are, with the eventual goal of them entering into this series of trials that selects the leadership for the world, winning and helping to change the world for the better. So 2 of the characters in here are a red blood that was raised as a blue blood, and due to past trauma her life has kind of gone off the rails, and a blue blood who was one of the ones that was swapped and is actually being raised as a red blood. And then the plot line of this book follows the structure of this series of trials. So you have like your leaders in this world, which are called wardens, and then every 10 years they host this series of trials that elects the disciples who will eventually then become the wardens. So I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this a lot. I really liked the writing. I liked the characters. It had a couple of issues, especially early on, where it just seemed a little bit too convenient. Like the way that the characters got into the positions they needed to be for the rest of this book seemed to be a little bit too convenient to be wholly believable. But in spite of that, I still enjoyed it because my favorite thing about this is the world building. It has a complex, like well thought out world, and also plot threads woven throughout here that aren't resolved at the end. So you know, like they come to a little bit of a head, but you know that they're mainly going to carry through to the next book. It focuses on this plot line of the trials, but also has threads like woven throughout it that you know are going to play a big part in the sequels. So I really liked how well thought out that was, even though we had some conveniences in the plot and the characters like weren't really doing it for me to start off with. Now this book did have a little bit of an issue with fat phobia that I have talked about extensively in the vlog where I read this, but there was fat phobia on behalf of some of the characters, which is fine because they were like bad characters. It was intended to like define the relationship between the characters and also what kind of characters, the fat phobic ones, are. But then there was also just the way that the fat main character was introduced. It felt like the author was trying to establish that she was fat without saying that she was fat as like better writing, but the way that it came off just wasn't good. And then there was also instances where the fat main character was compared to a lump of lard and also a steaming dumpling just in the description, in like scenes that have like her fatness has no relevance to it. So do be wary of that going in. I don't necessarily think that there was ill intent on behalf of the author. I do just feel like it's a little bit of ignorance that came into play, because like saying somebody's hanging around like a lump of lard or sitting around like a lump of lard is a saying, but it's interesting that it was only used, like sayings like that were only used when relating to the fat character and none of the other characters in this world. But definitely a very promising start to a series. I will 100% be reading the second book in this series, one of my highlights of the month as well, and I gave this one 4 stars. The final Goldsboro book that I read was Lost in Time by E.G. Riddle, and this was very much not what I thought it was, but I enjoyed it regardless. So the synopsis of this says that it is about a guy who's a scientist and he finds himself trapped in the dinosaur age, and it's about him and also his daughter who is trying to get him out of that age. So I feel like the synopsis of this and the cover and the design leads you to believe that the focus of this book is this dinosaur time period, but actually this is more of a thriller plotline with a sci-fi edge. I'd call this a sci-fi thriller because the actual story of this is that we are following a group of scientists who are called the Absalom 6, and they were the inventors of this time machine that they intended to serve a different purpose, but they ended up creating a time machine where they couldn't control where people were sent. So it wasn't really functional as anything other than a correctional device where you could send the worst of the worst, like the pedophiles and the serial killers could be sent back into their own alternate dimension to an undisclosed time period because nobody can control like the actual outcome of this time machine. So the story starts off where one of the 6 scientists, the Absalom 6, have been murdered, and the other one and his daughter are thought to have murdered her. So the irony of it is that the daughter gets off and the scientist who helped to create this time machine ends up a victim of his own invention as he is sent back to the time of dinosaurs, and then his daughter as well as the remaining 4 Absalom scientists are working together to try and bring him back and clear his name. Very little, I won't say why, because the plot twist in here was one of the reasons why I liked this book so much, but the dinosaur time period is a very minimal part of this book. I would say that less than a quarter of this book is relating to the dinosaur period. It just happens that that is where the time machine sends people, which is why it's relevant to this story. But ultimately, this is like a fast-paced murder mystery that has extra twists and turns because time travel is involved. So I did give this 3 stars. I definitely really enjoyed it. I think I read this in about 2 sittings because it's so fast-paced and so gripping, but this is definitely a story that isn't going to stick with me. So while it was fun in the moment, I felt about this the way that I feel about the majority of thrillers or fast-paced books that I read. It was fun, enjoyable, and entertaining in the moment, but it's not going to leave a lasting impression on me. If I recommend this, it will be because it's fast-paced, because it's compelling, maybe in a video with thrillers or sci-fi thrillers, but I never really recommend this book outside of those bounds. I then read my Alpha Ho book for December, which is my Patreon book club, and that was Famine by Laura Thalassa. Quite a few people expected this to be my favorite book in the Four Horsemen series, and I can confirm that it was not. It is actually currently my least favorite book in the Four Horsemen series. So every book in this series has a very similar plot line. We are following the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse one by one as they come to Earth to end the world, and each one of them falls in love with a human woman that kind of tempers him and makes him change his mind a little bit. So this one is following Famine, who has the ability to either grow or kill plants, and the human woman in question in this one is called Anna, and she is actually a sex worker. She's met Famine before and she actually took pity on him and saved his life, and he wanted to take her with him. However, he sacked her city, so she pretty much said no way and ended up on her own separate path. However, Famine and Anna's paths cross once more when Famine turns up once again to sack the new city that Anna lives in. So she goes to him expecting him to remember her, but he orders her to be killed along with everybody else. She actually survives, and when she's recovered, she hunts him down to make him pay for what he's done to her. The one thing that I did enjoy about this book in particular is that with Anna being a sex worker and having suffered abuse at the hands of men in the past, and also having suffered abuse by a family member when she was younger. She had a little bit of a different, only a little bit of a different mindset on killing people than the heroines of the first two books in this series, because she thinks that some people should be punished for their actions. And I really enjoyed how that came into play, especially throughout one section of this book. Famine as a character, pretty sexy. He was all right. I enjoyed him. I knew he was sassy going into it, but I expected him to be like a flirty kind of sassy, like Cassian. However, he's more of like a deadpan, gives no fucks kind of sassy. And I did like that about him. But I think this one to me was just very, very boring. I don't know whether it's because all of the books follow like a kind of similar plot line, so it's like more of something that I've already read, or whether it was because this one in particular just had less going on in it. In Pestilence, they move around a lot more than they do in this one. And in War, there's a lot of extra parts because we're following War and his war band, and there are like relevant characters within the war band that play a role in the story. So sadly this one wasn't a hit for me, but I am looking forward to Death, because based on the end of this and based on my theories about Death, I feel like the plot is just going to be slightly different, and Death is going to like bring the series and the apocalypse as a whole together. I then read my only 5-star of the month, which was Lore Olympus Volume 3 by Rachel Smith. I saved this as my Boxing Day read because I read the first volume last Boxing Day, and it ended up being like a last minute favorite of the year. This one I really enjoyed. I enjoyed it more than Volume 2. Lore Olympus is a bind up of a webcomic that is a retelling of Greek mythology, especially focusing on a romance between Hades and Persephone. It has been modernized and brought to the 21st century, and with that comes a lot of relatability. But saying that, it doesn't shy away from some of the darker elements of Greek myth, including like domestic abuse and child abuse, sexual assault, all that kind of stuff, and content warnings, especially in this volume for sexual assault. So the one thing that I love about this is that it is compelling. It's one of those comics like Saga where I'm invested from the beginning and I care about these characters. The first volume was 400 pages of mutual pining, and my only kind of criticism about Volume 2 is that it was more about Hades and Persephone as individual characters, which is fine and adds to the story as a whole, but I just missed like their kind of dynamic together, which was brought a little bit more to the forefront again as we were coming to the end of this volume. So Volume 1 is still my favorite, but Volume 3 was very promising, and I am of course excited for Volume 4. This has gorgeous art in it as well. I love the art style in this series, and this is very firmly, well, I was going to say it's very fast becoming one of my favorite comic series. It pretty much already is. And then I finished off the month with a couple of romances. It was a romance heavy month without me kind of intending it to be in December. And I read my very first Christmas romance, which was not a Christmas romance that I thought I was going to be reading, but that was Tangled in Tinsel by Trelina Pucci. But I'm wondering if her last name is Pucci because it looks like a different word. So this one is a reverse harem novella. It's long for a novella, which is one of my criticisms of it, but it is a reverse harem novella about a woman who's an interior designer who has had multiple contracts with these 4 hot guys who are all friends, and she is just finishing up work on a cabin for them so that they can host this massive Christmas party when she gets news of a storm rolling in, and she ends up snowed in with them over a weekend. So it turns out that these guys team up regularly, and they've had their eye on this interior designer, but they intended on approaching her after New Year, after her contract with them was up, but they find themselves with an opportunity that they can't turn down. So I enjoyed this one. I gave it 3 stars. Reverse harem is a little bit spotty with me. It's not my favorite because I'm more of a fan of sexual tension and slow burn, which is something that I feel is hard to establish when we have like 4 male main characters in here. Everything kind of just moves a little bit too fast for me, and then I find by the time we get to the sexy scenes, there's just too many people for me to remember who anybody is. Now this one is one that I did enjoy. We spent the first 100 to 150 pages kind of warming up before it like fully got into it, which and warming up I mean like in character development ways, not in other ways. before it got into like any group scenes, which I appreciated. I just prefer my smut, like I said, as like a one night novella kind of situation, especially when it comes to something like reverse harem, because I don't feel like one weekend in a cabin is enough for you to decide that you want to spend the rest of your lives with 4 men. Like that's a lifestyle that I feel like you haven't had time to think about, that's based on some really great sex that you had in a cabin at the weekend. And that is just me being picky, because I know that romance isn't necessarily supposed to be the most realistic thing. But something that I also enjoyed about this is that it's kind of like a Hallmark movie, but obviously with very adult content. There's some humorous moments, like at the beginning she's in the shower and it's this big fancy shower and she doesn't know what buttons she's pressing, so chaos ensues as she turns the speakers on and the water goes freezing cold, etc. Sometimes the humor didn't quite hit with me, and it also was a little bit cheesy and a little bit cringy, which I wasn't a fan of. But overall I liked that like slightly cheesy humorous edge to it. Some of the guys were pretty hot. If you want to know my favorite, then it's definitely Cole. And considering I prefer it as a one smutty night as opposed to a lifelong relationship setup kind of situation, I did actually like the end of this one. 3 stars from me. It was a good time. I just prefer my smut to be a little bit shorter. And then my last book of the year, it was unintentional. I did think I was going to finish something else, but regardless, my last book of the year was definitely a highlight. It was also my 100th book of the year, actually, but it was Brutal Prince by Sophie Lark. I've heard amazing things about Sophie Lark, so I was expecting good things when I was going into this, but the only thing that I know about Sophie Lark is that everybody loves her, so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into here. So this one is the first book in the Brutal Birthright series, which is a series of mafia romances. I do know that there is a spin-off series to this as well, which I can't remember the name of, but it's generational, so it follows the kids of like some of the couples in this first series. But this one, this book in particular anyway, is about 2 warring mafia families. The female main character in here, Ada, is from the Italian family, and the male main character, Callum, is the head, or like the eldest son of the Irish family. So this starts off with the kids of the Italian family, the Gallos, heading over to the home of the Irish family, the Griffins, to crash the party of their youngest daughter. They don't want to cause any trouble. It's just going to be like this big awesome party. I think they're ranging from like mid to late 20s, so like 27-ish, all the way down to 20, which is where Ada is. But they go and crash this party for this 19-year-old girl, and they get into a little bit of trouble while they're there. Ada is just exploring the house. She shouldn't be, but she is. And she wanders into the library where she finds this really heavy pocket watch. So while she's there, Callum enters the library, so she hides quickly and tucks the watch into her pocket. And to cause a distraction so that she can get out of the library unseen, she accidentally sets fire to the curtains. Callum notices that the watch is missing, assumes that somebody's stolen it, and thinks that the Gallos are responsible. So he hunts them down at this after party where Ada, her older brother Sebastian, and Callum get into an altercation where she chucks the watch into a lake. Callum dives in after it, and his bodyguard or henchman or whatever ends up beating up Ada's older brother and shattering his knee. So these 2 families are suiting up, ready to go to war, when the patriarchs of the family, the head of the families, meet and decide that they're tired of conflict. They've lost too many people on each side through conflicts throughout history. Both of the families are dwindling, and it would be more beneficial to both of them if they united the family. So Ada and Callum end up solving this conflict by entering into a forced marriage. I loved this. Weirdly, the thing that I enjoyed the least about it was the romance. I feel like we lacked proper chemistry and sexual tension between them, and I think I was just expecting a little bit more of a slow burn as they warmed up to each other, because it's very much like an enemies to lovers kind of situation. They get to the hate sex pretty quickly, and I personally, like, I'm a sexual tension gal, so I like a slow fiery burn. Like, I like them so mad at each other they want to rip each other's clothes off, but they don't, and that just kind of wasn't what this was. That being said, the sexy scenes were hot. I liked them both as characters. I liked that they both had their own kind of agendas. I liked that Ada was a like strong, confident, intelligent female character. Callum was a little bit of a dominating, like powerful male. If you don't like alpha males, maybe not the book for you, because he's very much like Ada's a little bit more chaotic and he's a little bit more straight-laced, and with that comes his element of like wanting to control, which creates like an interesting sexy time dynamic in Brutal Prince. My favorite thing about this though was the writing style. This writing style was so compelling that I read this, I think I was 44 pages into it, and then I read the entire rest of this book pretty much in one sitting. It was so addictive, so compulsively readable, and even though the romance wasn't my favorite thing, I can 100% tell you that I will read more from Sophie Lark. I'm actually interested to see the rest of the books in this series because I know that they each follow a different member of either the Gallo or Griffin family, and each one deals with different tropes. So I think the next one's a little bit of a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it has, I think, kidnapping in it. So depending, I think, on what tropes you enjoy, depends on which book in this series you'll enjoy the most. But yeah, this was a great introduction to Sophie Lark, and if you're looking for something that you just want to fly through and devour, would recommend Brutal Prince. And then the last book that I made progress in that I started in December was Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. I am 124 pages into it. I won't tell you much about it because I haven't read it, but I will say that I'm enjoying it very much, and I am excited. I'm very excited to continue. Actually, this was more compelling, or is more compelling, than I anticipated it being. So there you have it. Those are all of the books that I read in the month of December. I am expecting great things from January because throughout January I do also, like December, have a little bit more free time, and I feel like the last 2 weeks of December proved that when I have time and when I don't have other things that's occupying my mind, I mean, it's like anyone, I guess. It's not even necessarily that I read more, although I do. It's that I'm more focused and I read faster because I have less other things going on. So I'm anticipating I'm hoping for a decent stack read in January, and I'm also very excited to get on with some January reading and my January TBR. So happy new year, guys. 2022 wasn't the best year for me, but I'm hoping for great things for 2023. I hope you had a great time celebrating New Year however you choose to do that. Down in the comments, leave a firework emoji if you want to let me know that you were here but you don't really have anything else to say. And aside from that, let me know what your favorite book that you read in December was. I think mine was definitely Lore Olympus Volume 3. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.